to see Alice developing the skills that she would later put together in her own work, her chosen work. And the first of those that jumped out at me was networking skills. Alice had a very good memory for faces and what other people were able to do that she personally wasn't very interested in doing. And so you hear and read throughout the book people whose acquaintance she met at Swarthmore, living on in her life over the years. And she would call on them, and she developed an uncanny ability for giving that person a little gift in addition to calling on them. So it was a silly little gift, really. And one of the clearest examples that I came across was when she got the house set up in Washington before the march. People kept pouring in to volunteer for her. And she would walk, she'd meet them at the door and introduce herself and say, well, what would you like to do here? And the woman would say, I don't know how to do anything. And Alice Paul would say, well, surely you can type a little bit. I just learned how, let me show you. And, or, well, we do have a mail room in back, and we do have envelopes that need stuffing, and we do need people to do errands. So she'd always find room for the people who wanted help and that she knew could be encouraged to help more in the movement. That was the first one that I picked up on. So Alice goes to the settlement house and stays there for the summer following her graduation. And then over the summer, she applies to the University of Pennsylvania, which had begun to admit women to graduate courses, not to undergraduate courses, but to graduate courses. And she met some professors there who became seminal in forming her ideas. And it's easy to see how they gave her little gifts of, but wouldn't you like to? But wouldn't you like to do this? Instead of saying, well, but I don't know if you can find a role for that. I don't think if a woman can really do that. They were encouraging. A couple of them actually founded the American Political Science Association because they thought that women should be involved in politics. And boy, did Alice pick up on that. Women need to be involved in politics. That is the only way that you will get ahead in your chosen profession. Alice hadn't really chosen one yet, but they could see this happening. So the next thing that happened for Alice was that one of them suggested she go to Woodbrook. That's in England. It hadn't been there very long, but if she went with a few other Americans to Woodbrook, some doors would open for her that would not open in this country for a long time. So, hello, George Cadbury. I'm so glad to meet you. You're involved in the family chocolate trade?
Yes, along with other concerns. My father, John, founded the company. It grew up quickly. We needed more space. My brother, Richard, and I moved the business down here to the Birmingham area. We knew we had to provide not only decent wages, but housing and cultural opportunities for the country folk we were hiring.
Was this part of being a Quaker?
Well, other residents were involved too, but it is in line with some of my social concerns. I rented this big house first, needed room for the 11 children. Eventually, we built another home. George Wilhelm Roundtree and I decided to turn that first house into a Quaker retreat center. We saw a spiritual decline coming. The idea was to bring young folk from around the world to learn from each other.
So in England, Friends were beginning to diminish as a spiritual entity when they became more socially concerned. And the choice of the Birmingham area meant that there were a lot of people in that area who were doing what these two people were doing. George Wilhelm Roundtree ended up being an author of books and yes, and so on. So how successful successful were you at the beginning?
We did encourage Quaker groups abroad to drum up scholarships, so we had Americans and Dutch friends here in the first years. Overall, we're satisfied.
So, I hear you then bought a newspaper?
Yes, the Daily News. I had to do something to change that imperialistic Balfour's tune. Humph! Colonies over social needs.
You've got to fall in love with a man who has 11 children and wants to go on and do a lot with them. One of his sons, Richard, ended up being a primary economics professor and writer of books, which took what the Cadburys had begun doing and put it into the language of economics. Yes, you will have a better workforce if you educate them and take care of them. And Cadbury spoke firmly on old age pensions, public health, anything that would bring these country folk that they were bringing into the Birmingham area, into the cultural scene and make them better workers. Thank you, George Cadbury. Well, once again, Alice's mother is very concerned about Alice staying gentle. And she's worried because anybody who reads newspapers voluminously, which all of Tacy's family did, that was one of the reading experiences around the table, would learn very easily what was going on with the suffragette movement in England. And that's a distinction. They call themselves suffragettes, and we call them suffragists. Anyway, and Alice ended up meeting one of them and getting inducted into their efforts. Now, this was a family of women whose last name was Pankhurst. And we all know them. We can't study anything about women's votes without getting involved in one of the Pankhursts. So the mother was a formidable figure, and she had these three very good-looking and knowledgeable children, daughters who'd been really educated beyond their means, let us say. And that meant that one of the ones who really got involved with Alice Paul had gone for a law degree and then had sat for her exam and was laughed out of the audience of men who said, "Well, you're not talking law here." And her response basically was, "Well, it ought to be." And they escorted her out of the room and did not give her her degree. Anyway, Emmeline Pankhurst was a woman to get it done, and she would get it done in any way, shape, or form, and that meant being very active and provoking to the powers that be. So we're not just going to be polite women marching in the street asking for favors for the government. No, we're going to be in the government's face. And how did she do that? She very carefully planned everything that she did to the nth degree. And Alice Paul learned a lot from being around the Pankhurst girls. She learned so much that almost all the techniques that were developed in England came into this country by way of Alice Paul. But she put her Quaker spin on it. So, the Brits at that time had a light and lively attitude towards prisons. You could be a political prisoner and you were treated one way. And you could be a rabble-rouser and you were treated another way. And the rabble-rousers they were used to